There is something most people don't understand until it's too late. People don't reveal their truth in a single moment. They reveal it in patterns, not in what they say once, but in what they do repeatedly. And the danger is this: when emotions are involved, when attraction is strong, when attention feels good, clarity becomes clouded. You stop observing. You start assuming. You stop seeing reality. And you start seeing what you want to believe. This is how many people walk straight into confusion, disappointment, and regret. Not because the signs were hidden, but because they were ignored. The Stoics warned about this long ago. They understood something that most people today overlook. Human nature does not lie, but perception often does. In a world filled with noise, distractions, and constant stimulation, people have mastered the art of presentation. They know how to appear a certain way. They know how to say the right things. They know how to create an image that feels convincing, even when it's not complete. But no matter how refined the image is, reality always leaves traces. Small behaviors, subtle reactions, repeated patterns. And if you train yourself to observe without emotion, without attachment, without desperation, you begin to see what others miss. Now understand this clearly. This is not about attacking anyone. This is not about labeling or condemning people. This is about awareness. Because the cost of ignorance in relationships is not small. It shows up as wasted time, emotional exhaustion, broken focus, and sometimes a complete loss of direction. And all of it could have been avoided with better observation. The Stoics believed in one principle above all: see things as they are, not as you wish them to be. Simple, but difficult, because seeing clearly requires discipline. It requires you to step back from your feelings, to detach from the excitement, to silence the urge to ignore what feels uncomfortable. And most people are not willing to do that. They would rather stay in illusion than face truth early. But truth does not disappear. It waits. And when it finally shows itself, it doesn't ask for permission. It disrupts everything. So the question is not whether people reveal who they are. They always do. The real question is, will you be aware enough to notice it early? In this video, you're going to learn to sharpen that awareness, to see beyond words, to recognize patterns, to understand behavior at a deeper level. Not so you can judge, but so you can choose wisely. Because who you allow into your life will either build your peace or destroy it. There is no neutral ground. And if you've ever found yourself confused by someone's behavior, if you've ever ignored signs and later regretted it, if you've ever wondered how you didn't see things earlier, then this is for you. Take this seriously. Not emotionally, but intellectually. Because once you learn to see clearly, you can never be easily misled again. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And as you go through this video, if you gain any value at all, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more deep, powerful, and practical Stoic lessons that will sharpen your thinking and elevate your life. Now, let's begin. The language of consistency versus contradiction. If you want to understand people on a deeper level, don't start with what they say. Start with what remains stable over time. Because words are easy. Anyone can explain themselves. Anyone can justify a moment. Anyone can create a version of events that sounds reasonable in the present. But consistency cannot be faked for long. Over time, patterns begin to speak louder than explanations. You begin to notice small contradictions. Not always obvious ones. Not always dramatic ones. But subtle shifts in stories. Changes in tone. Adjustments in details depending on the situation. At first, you may dismiss it. You tell yourself it's nothing. You assume it's forgetfulness. You try to give benefit of the doubt. And sometimes, that's fair. But wisdom is not built on isolated moments. Wisdom is built on repetition. The Stoics place great importance on clarity of perception. They believe that confusion is not always caused by lack of information, but by emotional interference with interpretation. When emotion is strong, judgment becomes flexible. You begin to accept inconsistencies you would normally question. You begin to rationalize things you would normally examine. You begin to overlook patterns you would normally notice. And that is where misjudgment begins. Because contradiction, when repeated, is not noise. It is information. A stable person does not need to constantly reshape their past. They do not need to adjust their narrative depending on who is listening. They do not need to rebuild their identity in different rooms. Their story remains grounded, even if it is imperfect. But when someone's version of reality shifts too often, it creates instability in how you experience them. One version of them appears in one context. Another version appears elsewhere. And you are left trying to reconcile two different realities. This is mentally exhausting. And over time, it affects trust. Not because you are trying to be suspicious, but because your mind naturally seeks coherence. Humans are built to detect patterns. When patterns break too often, the mind starts to hesitate. It stops trusting effortlessly. It starts analyzing constantly. It begins to question even small details. And that is a sign in itself, not of paranoia, but of inconsistency being present. A Stoic approach does not rush to conclusions. It simply observes. It allows time to do what emotion cannot do alone, reveal structure. Because truth does not need pressure to appear. It emerges through repetition. So when you notice small contradictions, don't ignore them. Don't overreact either. Just record them mentally. Because clarity is not built from one moment of insight. It is built from many small observations aligned over time. And when those observations start pointing in the same direction, you no longer need to guess. You already know what you are seeing. Now let's move to the next layer of behavior. Emotional attachment that moves too fast. One of the most misunderstood things in human connection is intensity at the beginning. Because intensity feels like truth. When someone shows strong interest early, communicates often, expresses deep emotions quickly, or creates a fast emotional bond, it can feel like something meaningful is forming. But intensity is not the same as depth. And depth is not the same as speed. In reality, anything that develops too quickly emotionally often hasn't had time to become stable. It is driven more by feeling than by understanding. The Stoics would describe this as being led by impulse rather than reason. An impulse is powerful, but it is not stable. It rises quickly, and often changes just as fast. When emotional attachment forms too rapidly, it can bypass something very important: observation. Because in healthy connection, there is a natural pace where both people are still learning each other. Not just enjoying each other, but understanding patterns, reactions, boundaries, and consistency. But when things move too fast emotionally, that space for observation becomes compressed. Everything feels immediate. Everything feels certain. Everything feels meant to be, until reality introduces time. And time reveals what intensity hides. You begin to see how someone handles frustration, how they respond when attention is not constant, how they behave when novelty fades, how stable their emotions truly are when conditions change. And often, what looked like deep emotional connection at the start begins to shift, not always into something bad, but into something less consistent than expected. This is why the Stoic mindset encourages patience. Not emotional distance, but measured awareness. A calm willingness to let time reveal character. Because character is not proven in the beginning. It is revealed in continuation. Many people mistake emotional acceleration for compatibility. They assume that because something feels strong early, it must be right. But feelings are not designed to measure truth. They are designed to signal experience. And experiences can be misleading when they are too concentrated in a short period. A person who moves emotionally too fast may not be fully grounded in themselves. They may be seeking connection to fill a gap. They may be driven by excitement rather than stability. They may confuse emotional stimulation with emotional compatibility. And if you are not observant, you get pulled into that pace. You start matching intensity instead of evaluating direction. And once both people are moving fast emotionally, it becomes harder to step back and see clearly. Because slowing down feels like loss. But in reality, slowing down is protection. It gives space for truth to surface. So when you notice emotional attachment forming too quickly, don't immediately label it as love, or destiny, or alignment. Pause internally. Observe consistency over time. Because what is real does not need to rush. And what rushes too much often hasn't been fully understood yet. A Stoic perspective values stability over excitement. Because excitement fades. But stability builds something lasting. Now let's go deeper into the next pattern. Overcompensation through image and behavior. One of the clearest signs of internal imbalance is not what a person hides, but what they try too hard to project. When someone is deeply grounded in themselves, there is a natural ease in how they carry their identity. They do not force impressions. They do not constantly perform. They do not feel the need to prove who they are at every moment. Their presence speaks for itself. But when there is insecurity beneath the surface, something shifts. A person begins to overcompensate. Not always in obvious ways, but in subtle patterns that repeat over time. They may become overly concerned with how they are perceived. They may adjust their behavior depending on who is watching. They may lean heavily into attention, admiration, or validation from others to reinforce their identity. And the more unstable they feel internally, the more controlled their external image becomes. The Stoics understood something important about this. They believed that true strength does not require constant demonstration. Because when something is real, it does not need to be repeatedly proven. It simply is. But overcompensation works differently. It is not grounded in being, it is driven by appearing. And there is a difference between the two. A person focused on being authentic is consistent regardless of audience. A person focused on appearing a certain way will shift depending on the environment. This is where patterns become important again. Because over time, you begin to notice how someone behaves differently in different contexts. With certain people, they are calm, controlled, and composed. With others, they become more expressive, more performative, more attention-seeking. It is not necessarily intentional deception. Often, it is unconscious adaptation. But even unconscious behavior reveals internal state. Because when someone is secure in themselves, they do not need to switch versions of who they are. They remain stable. But when someone is trying to maintain an image, they become sensitive to perception. They start to monitor reactions. They adjust tone. They emphasize certain traits while hiding others. And slowly, their identity becomes fragmented. Not because they are fake in a malicious sense, but because they are no longer operating from inner stability. They are operating from external feedback. And external feedback is unstable by nature. It changes depending on environment, attention, and social context. So if someone depends heavily on it, their behavior will naturally reflect that instability. This is where emotional confusion often begins in relationships. Because you are not dealing with one consistent version of a person. You are dealing with different versions depending on the situation. And that creates uncertainty. A Stoic mindset teaches you to value alignment over impression. To look for consistency over performance. Because performance is temporary. But character reveals itself over time without effort. So when you observe someone constantly managing how they appear, constantly adjusting themselves to fit situations, constantly seeking validation to reinforce identity, do not rush to conclusions. But do not ignore the pattern either. Because overcompensation is often not about confidence. It is about covering instability. And instability always shows itself eventually. Now let's move into the next layer of observation. Emotional control that depends on the environment. One of the most revealing patterns in human behavior is emotional stability under different conditions. Because it is easy to appear calm when everything is going well. It is easy to be kind when there is attention. It is easy to be composed when there is validation. It is easy to act balanced when the environment is favorable. But true emotional maturity is not measured in comfort. It is measured in contrast. When circumstances shift, when attention reduces, when expectations are not met, when stress enters the situation, that is when the real internal structure of a person becomes visible. And what you often discover is this. Some people are stable from within, while others are stable only when supported from outside. A person with internal emotional control does not become easily shaken by external changes. They do not rely on constant reassurance to stay grounded. They do not lose balance when attention shifts. They do not collapse emotionally when situations become uncomfortable. Their stability comes from understanding themselves. But when emotional control is externally dependent, everything becomes conditional. Their mood changes based on who is available. Their behavior shifts based on how much attention they receive. Their reactions become unpredictable when expectations are not met. This is not always intentional. In many cases, it is a lack of emotional structure, and the Stoics spoke deeply about this idea. They believed that a person who is ruled by external conditions is not truly free. Because if your peace depends on others, then your peace is constantly at risk. And over time, this creates instability in relationships. Not necessarily through conflict, but through unpredictability. One moment everything feels calm. The next moment something small triggers a shift in mood. And then there is withdrawal, or emotional distance, or sudden intensity. To the outside observer, it can feel confusing. Because there is no clear pattern in the moment, only patterns over time. And that is where awareness becomes important. You begin to notice that emotional responses are not consistent. They are reactive. They are shaped by environment rather than anchored in principle. And when emotional responses are environment-driven, stability becomes fragile. Because environments change constantly. People change. Situations change. Attention changes. And if someone's emotional state is tied to all of these external factors, then their behavior will always reflect that instability. A Stoic perspective teaches something very different. It teaches that while you cannot control external conditions, you can control your internal response. And that control is what creates stability. So when you observe someone whose emotional behavior shifts significantly based on external circumstances, do not rush to label them. Instead, recognize the pattern. Because emotional inconsistency is not just about mood. It is about internal grounding. And without grounding, reliability becomes difficult. Not impossible, but unstable. And instability always shows itself, especially over time. Now let's move into the next pattern of behavior. Attention-seeking patterns and social energy dependence. There is a difference between being socially open and being emotionally dependent on attention. On the surface, they can look similar. Both may be expressive. Both may enjoy conversations. Both may be active in social spaces. But the intention behind the behavior is what separates them. A socially grounded person engages with others from a place of fullness. They are not empty before they enter a space. They are not seeking identity through interaction. They are not dependent on external validation to feel complete. They enjoy connection, but they do not rely on it to regulate their emotional state. But when someone depends on attention for emotional balance, something different happens. Their behavior begins to orbit around visibility. Being noticed becomes important. Being acknowledged becomes necessary. Being desired becomes emotionally rewarding in a way that goes beyond normal social interaction. And over time, this creates a pattern. They begin to unconsciously place themselves in environments where attention is available. They become sensitive to who is engaging with them and who is not. They may even shift their behavior depending on the type of attention they are receiving. This is not always calculated. In fact, most of the time, it is automatic. Because attention, for them, is not just social. It becomes emotional fuel. And like any fuel source, when it runs low, discomfort appears. This is where Stoic philosophy becomes very relevant. The Stoics emphasized self-sufficiency of the mind. Not isolation, but independence from external validation. Because when your sense of value depends on external approval, you are no longer in control of your emotional stability. You are reacting to the environment instead of grounding yourself internally. And that creates unpredictability. One day, attention is high, and everything feels positive. The next day, attention shifts, and mood, behavior, or interest may change with it. To someone observing from the outside, it can feel inconsistent. But from the inside, it feels like need. A need to be seen. A need to be acknowledged. A need to be emotionally filled by external sources. And when that need is strong, it can influence decisions. It can influence boundaries. It can influence attachment. It can influence how relationships are formed and maintained. This is why awareness is important. Because attention-seeking behavior is not always loud. Sometimes it is subtle. It may appear as constant engagement. It may appear as always being available socially. It may appear as discomfort when not receiving interaction. But underneath all of it is a reliance on external validation to maintain emotional balance. And anything that relies heavily on external factors is unstable by nature. Because external factors are unpredictable. People change. Interest shifts. Environments vary. So if emotional stability is tied to these things, then stability itself becomes fragile. A Stoic approach encourages something very different. It encourages inner grounding, the ability to remain steady regardless of attention levels, the ability to maintain self-worth without external reinforcement, the ability to exist fully without needing constant validation. And when someone has that, their behavior becomes more consistent. Not because they are less social, but because they are internally regulated. So when you observe patterns of attention dependence, don't rush to conclusions. But also do not ignore what it reveals. Because when attention becomes a requirement rather than a choice, it shapes behavior in ways that eventually become visible. And over time, those patterns always surface. Now let's move into the next layer of observation. Avoidance of stillness and emotional self-reflection. One of the most revealing patterns in human behavior is not always what people do in public, but what they avoid in private. Because silence has a way of exposing what noise is designed to hide. When a person is constantly engaged, always talking, always scrolling, always moving, always surrounded by stimulation, it may look like a busy life on the surface. But sometimes, it is not busyness. It is avoidance. Avoidance of thoughts that appear when everything becomes quiet. Avoidance of feelings that rise when distractions disappear. Avoidance of self-reflection that becomes unavoidable in stillness. The Stoics understood something deeply important about this. They believed that a person cannot truly understand the world without first learning to sit with themselves. Because self-awareness is not found in external activity. It is found in internal silence. But silence is uncomfortable for many people. Not because silence is harmful, but because it removes distraction. And when distraction is removed, awareness increases. You begin to notice your own thoughts more clearly. You begin to confront your patterns more honestly. You begin to feel emotions you may have been suppressing without realizing it. And for someone who is not used to that level of internal confrontation, it can feel overwhelming. So instead of sitting in stillness, they move. They distract. They engage. They surround themselves with activity, people, noise, and stimulation. Not necessarily because they enjoy it all the time, but because it prevents them from turning inward. And over time, this becomes a habit. A pattern of constant external engagement that leaves very little room for internal reflection. This is where emotional depth begins to weaken. Because a person who avoids stillness also avoids processing. And unprocessed emotions do not disappear. They accumulate. They influence reactions. They shape decisions. They affect relationships in subtle but consistent ways. To an observer, it may not always be obvious at first. But over time, you begin to notice something. A discomfort with quiet moments. A tendency to fill silence quickly. A resistance to being alone without stimulation. And when someone cannot sit peacefully with themselves, it often reflects how they will behave in relationships as well. Because relationships naturally contain silence. They contain waiting. They contain uncertainty. They contain moments where stimulation is not constant. And if a person is not comfortable internally, they will often try to fill those gaps externally. through constant communication, through emotional reassurance, through distraction within the relationship itself. And this can create pressure over time, not because of intention, but because of dependency. A Stoic mindset teaches something different. It teaches that silence is not something to escape from, but something to learn from. Because in silence, truth becomes visible. Not the truth you want to see, but the truth that already exists. So when you observe someone who consistently avoids stillness, who struggles with being alone, who fills every quiet moment with distraction, do not rush to judge them, but do not ignore the meaning behind it either. Because avoidance is still information. And information, when repeated, becomes a pattern. And patterns always reveal direction over time. Now let's move into the final layer of observation. Patterns of short-term connections and emotional resetting. If you want to understand people deeply, don't focus only on how they enter connections. Focus on how often those connections end, and what happens after. Because endings reveal more truth than beginnings ever do. At the beginning of any connection, there is naturally energy, curiosity, attention, excitement. Everything feels new, everything feels alive, everything feels full of possibility. But the real character of a pattern is not in the beginning. It is in repetition. When someone repeatedly forms connections that start intensely, but fade quickly, something important is happening beneath the surface. Not necessarily something dramatic or obvious, but something structural. There is often a cycle that repeats itself quietly. Initial excitement, fast emotional involvement, strong engagement, then gradual withdrawal, then disconnection, then a reset, and the cycle begins again. Over time, this pattern becomes familiar, not just to others, but even to the person living it. And because it becomes familiar, it begins to feel normal. But normal does not always mean healthy. The Stoics would look at this differently. They would not focus on how strong the feeling is at the start, but on whether it is stable enough to endure time, pressure, and change. Because anything real must survive time. Not just intensity, but time. And time introduces things emotion cannot simulate. Routine, conflict, distance, silence, responsibility. These are the elements that reveal whether something is built on depth or on temporary stimulation. When someone consistently moves from one connection to another, without long-term stability, it often reflects an internal pattern. Not always a conscious decision, but a behavioral rhythm. A preference for novelty over continuity. A comfort with beginnings, but discomfort with maintenance. A stronger attraction to excitement than to stability. And over time, this shapes their emotional structure. Because the mind adapts to what it repeatedly practices. So if someone repeatedly resets emotionally, they may become less attached to continuity itself. Not because they don't care, but because their system is trained for movement rather than depth. And this is where misunderstandings often occur in relationships. Because you may be dealing with someone who genuinely feels strongly in the moment, but struggles with sustaining that feeling beyond the initial phase. Not due to lack of emotion, but due to lack of emotional endurance. And without awareness of this pattern, people often assume intention where there is only habit, or assume depth where there is only intensity. A Stoic approach does not rush to assign meaning too quickly. It observes repetition. It studies cycles. It allows time to confirm what emotion tries to decide immediately. Because clarity is not found in the first impression. It is found in what remains after repeated exposure to time. So when you notice a pattern of short-lived connections, emotional resets, repeated beginnings without sustained continuity, do not react emotionally. Do not judge hastily. But do not ignore the structure either. Because life is not defined by isolated moments. It is defined by patterns that repeat long enough to become identity. And once you can see those patterns clearly, you are no longer guessing. You are understanding. Now let's bring everything together and close this reflection. Conclusion: seeing beyond appearance into pattern and truth. At the end of all observation, all reflection, all understanding, everything comes down to one simple ability. The ability to see clearly. Not emotionally. Not impulsively. Not through assumption or fear or desire. But through awareness of patterns over time. Because people are not defined by their strongest moment. Nor are they defined by their worst moment. They are defined by what they repeatedly do when time passes and attention fades. This is the part most people miss. They focus on words spoken in the moment. They focus on emotions expressed in intensity. They focus on what feels true right now. But what feels true in a moment is not always what remains true over time. And this is where confusion begins. Because emotions move fast. Attention changes quickly. Perception is easily influenced by presence and absence. But patterns do not change quickly. Patterns reveal structure. And structure reveals truth. The Stoic mindset does not ask you to distrust people. It asks you to understand people, to observe without distortion, to see without attachment, to think without emotional interference. Because when you are emotionally involved, you tend to explain away what you should be observing. You turn signals into excuses. You turn repetition into coincidence. You turn inconsistency into misunderstanding. Not because you are unaware, but because you are attached. And attachment clouds perception more than ignorance ever could. So the purpose of everything discussed is not judgment. It is awareness. Because awareness gives you something powerful. Choice. When you see clearly, you no longer move blindly into situations that were already showing you their nature. You no longer rely on potential instead of reality. You no longer ignore repeated patterns hoping for a different outcome. You no longer confuse intensity with stability. You begin to choose based on evidence, not emotion alone. And that changes everything. Because peace is not found in controlling others. Peace is found in understanding what you are dealing with, and responding accordingly. Sometimes that means continuing. Sometimes that means adjusting. Sometimes that means stepping back entirely. But in every case, the decision becomes yours. Not driven by confusion. Not shaped by illusion. Not influenced by temporary emotion. But grounded in clarity. That is the Stoic way. To see things as they are. To accept reality without distortion. And to act with wisdom based on what is real, not what is hoped for. So take this awareness with you. Not as suspicion, but as understanding. Not as judgment, but as insight. Because once you learn to recognize patterns, you cannot unsee them. And once you cannot unsee them, you begin to move differently, more calmly, more wisely, more intentionally. If you have made it this far, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And if this brought you value, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more deep Stoic reflections that sharpen your thinking and help you navigate life with clarity and strength. Stay aware. Stay grounded. And always choose clarity over confusion.